The geometry is not that much different except for the chainstay length. But the package of the yeet.
Yeet. It just doesn't know where.
Yeah, just toss it to me again. I'll just start from again.
Commencal's Meta SX is one of 3 mixed-wheeled bikes we've got in for this field test. And it's also the only aluminum enduro bike with us in Bellingham, Washington, the rest being either carbon fiber or steel. Now, Commencal says that the SX frame was designed around a 27.5-inch rear wheel and 29-inch front wheel from the start, with it getting different geometry and revised kinematics compared to its equal-wheeled brothers. And speaking of kinematics, suspension is typical Commencal, with it using a solid-looking single-pivot layout with a linkage. And there's now a geo-adjusting flip chip hidden in the clevis that also lets you fine-tune the bike's handling. Being aluminum and sold consumer direct, the SX is the least expensive bike at this field test at $5,800 American. Now, one thing to note, due to there not being many bike parts out there, the spec of our Meta SX test bike is a little different from what you might see on Commencal's website. But regardless, let's head to the testers and see how this new Meta SX performed on the trail. All right, so those are all the details for the aluminum Commencal Meta SX. It's time to talk about how this thing rides, and as always, we gotta get through climbing before we talk about descending. Alicia, let's talk about pedaling first. How does this thing perform when you are climbing up to the top of the mountain?
Yeah, so I think we have to get out of the way. The bike weighs 36 pounds, so it climbs about as well as you'd expect for that. That said, it actually is pretty all right in terms of efficiency. It doesn't feel like it loses much through the pedaling, and the suspension feels pretty well supported as it churns up the hill. The pedaling position is also fairly centered, so you have a really steep seat angle of 78 degrees, I believe, that puts you kind of right in between the very long front end and the also surprisingly long rear end. So you're kind of perched on top of the bike. It gives you enough authority to just pedal slowly up the hill.
Kaz, would you agree with that? Did you reach for the switch all the time, only some of the time when you're on smooth roads?
I never used the climb switch on this one. Like, it is pretty well supported. What they've done with the shock tune worked pretty well for pedaling.
Yeah.
And we've said the steep seat tube angle, again, just kind of puts in that upright position. Kind of a familiar feel with all these enduro bikes that are coming out. They're kind of converging on a similar geometry numbers. This one's pretty steep, I think 78.1, which is one of the steeper seat tube angles out of all the bikes here. Like, a couple are in that realm. I think that bikes probably can't go much steeper because on flat terrain it might start to feel a little bit weird, but this definitely isn't the bike to be putting out the miles on flat terrain. But for like the rides we did around here, a lot of steep climbs followed by steep descent, it works well, it's comfortable. But again, kind of a bigger, kind of just gets the job done, but you're not going to grab it to go set any KOMs or anything like that.
Alicia, you mentioned something earlier. You said that not only is the front end fairly long, but it also has a pretty long back end. So let's move on to how this thing performs when you're climbing up a rooty, rocky, slow, tricky single track. Is it a handful or not?
Yeah, so the bike almost everywhere is a little bit of a handful just because it's so long front to back, and it's a mullet setup, but surprisingly, unlike some of the other mullets, including the other one we have on test here, the back end isn't correspondingly short for the small rear wheel. So the whole bike still is pretty strung out, and getting that around tight switchbacks can feel kind of like a lot. It's not unmanageable by any means, especially like if you prefer a long bike, if you really like the stability. The good thing about the stability is you can go really slowly up technical stuff and kind of like pick your way through the techie climbs, and it's not gonna like tip over on you or spin out, whatever
traction
happens.
For days on these things, right?
Traction for days.
Like Alicia is kind of alluding to, on the straightaway, chunky, rough climbs, it has a lot of stability, so you can kind of motor your way up. It's like those hill climb motorcycles that you see that just kind of like scoot their way up the hill. It's good for that stuff. It's just more when you get the quick, tight direction changes, that's when you start really noticing like it's not the fastest bike to respond.
Okay, that's enough about the climbing. Let's talk about the stuff that the people are interested in, starting off with suspension performance on the downs. What do you make of this thing, Alicia?
This bike, suspension performed really, really well. So as we're gonna get into with the geometry and handling a little bit later, the bike is a freight train, but that RockShox suspension on it was really good on small bumps, also good on medium bumps and large bumps. It was really well supported, I found, and the bike holds traction so well. So it was raining on
Every day?
Yeah, all of the days. A lot of rain, a lot of off-camber wet routes. And out of all the bikes, this one might have been the one that you could just point on a kind of marginal line and trust that it would actually hold that straight line.
So it sounds like Commencal has done a good job of kind of striking that middle ground. Kaz, do you feel the same?
Yeah, the only issue I had with the rear shock, I thought it could potentially use a little lighter rebound tune. I ended up running the rebound almost all the way open, just to get to feel quick enough. But the overall feel, like this is definitely a nice planted bike. You land in the slippery roots and things, and it just sticks and it keeps going. So it's kind of nice. You can definitely trust it. Like it's got your back when things get strange. And that's where I found it the best, is in steeper, weirder trails. And then when you can let it run, especially once you're at a higher speed, it's really fun to ride.
So let's talk about handling now. It sounds like we moved on to that. Where does that length help you? I mean, I think I know where it's going to help, but tell us.
If you're pointed in a straight line down something really rough, this bike is going to be amazing. It's going to just make the rocks disappear and grow a pair of angel wings and just carry you away.
Just float over everything like it's not even there.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
In all seriousness, it does hold the line really well in the choppy stuff. And its weakness is just getting around quick turns. Like it doesn't corner that quickly. It's not an agile bike. But if you're not prioritizing agility, it's fast. It'll eat up the bumps.
Kaz, what does the bike feel like in those tight corners?
And again, it's just kind of like a bike you have to like dig your spurs in and make it go. Like once it wakes up, then it's good. So in the higher speeds, that kind of fades away. It doesn't feel as lethargic. Once you're up to speed, then it's not that hard. It's got all the stability, and the length kind of can really lean into it. It's like a bike park setting or anywhere with just kind of faster, more open tracks. Same thing around here. When we're in the steeper sections where you could just kind of see your exit and let it run, it felt so good. Kind of almost, I think it's a fun bike with flat pedals as well. Kind of like the heels down riding style where you're just like, here we go, it's going straight.
With its ability to hold line too, like going into corners at speed, when it did corner, when you could get it around, it was actually really satisfying to feel that really carby feeling and feel how quickly the bike would carry momentum out of a corner.
Kaz, I just want you to compare the Commencal to what sounds like a very different bike. That Patrol, both of you guys talked about how that Patrol is so versatile, and maybe that's not the case with this. So can you just kind of contrast and frame these two bikes for me?
Yeah, I think the big difference between the two, carbon frame versus aluminum frame. So you've got the Patrol's a lot lighter, and I think that does give it a little more energetic feel. It does have shorter chain stays as well. So that kind of has like that poppy playfulness that you could grab it for a more normal trail ride and not feel like you're too overbiked. Where the Commencal, it lets you know it's a big bike. Like you could do some enduro races with it too, but they'd have to be rough enduro races. If they're kind of mellower, rolly terrain enduro race, that's not really the bike I would grab. Where the Patrol, you could race it there and be okay. Like this is a bike for somewhere like Whistler. It's got the more bike parky kind of free ride feel rather than something that just encourages you to sprint against the clock.
Let's move on to components then. Alicia, can you tell us what you liked about this thing?
Yeah, so I mean the GX is really good value. I think they did a pretty good job of balancing where to spend the money and where to save a bit. And that worked flawlessly for us. And then we had really solid suspensions with that Zeb Ultimate fork and the Super Deluxe Ultimate shock.
That's where that money went. Better
yeah,
suspension.
It worked so well on that bike, and the whole package came together pretty nicely, I think.
Yeah, and we should mention also that our bike is a little different than the SX team. It's pretty close, but just because of supply chain issues and all that, they kind of did basically an a la carte build, which is also available to consumers. You can go on Commencal's website and you can pick and choose every little part. So I think the price on this one came at $5,800, where the team is actually $5,200, and that's because it had to upgrade to some i9 wheels. But yeah, it's a solid build kit. There's really nothing you need to swap out immediately.
What about the dropper post?
That I would swap out immediately. Yeah, and also the bars. Yeah.
Really, the handlebar as well?
Yeah, they're kind of strange. They're
flat.
They're flat, like a 15 mil rise, which I was nervous at first. I was like, I might need to swap these even earlier, but the bike actually has a fairly tall head tube, 125 millimeter head tube. So like the height was okay for me. But they have a kind of real pronounced back sweep and almost felt like a downward bend. So it's kind of like, felt a little strange. So I think I would swap the bars just for personal preference, but I think we kind of all were in agreement that the bars felt a little strange. And then the dropper post, we ran into issues with it, just pretty finicky with the amount of cable tension. And for me, it was a 175 post, which I would have rather 200, 210, but again, that's kind of a rider height thing. And also again, you can switch a lot of this stuff if you go with Commencal's a la carte program. But yeah, I didn't get along with the dropper.
Alicia, you've mentioned a couple times how you're not a big fan of super integrated cockpit components and stuff. Tell me about the Commencal on that.
Yeah, I mean, I just think that when you're trying to integrate the brake lever and the shift lever on the right hand and the brake lever and the dropper post lever on the left hand, you run into so many problems when it just comes to adjusting everything to where you can reach all the controls. I'm a little picky about the position of all of my controls, and so honestly, with almost every bike, unless it's really perfect, I would pretty much always prefer 4 different mounts for the 4 different things. And same with on this bike, the shift lever just couldn't quite go to the right position.
Yeah, I'll be the dissenting voice here. I usually like Matchmaker, but for me, it typically just works best when it is SRAM's own components. So on this one though, I ran into issues with the dropper post lever because it's a KS post, and their little Matchmaker thing that goes with the SRAM brake lever, it doesn't give you like hardly any range at all. So it really never got in the right position.
Let's go on to timed testing. Kaz, how did this work out for you?
For me, this bike was 5th place out of 7 bikes, although my 3rd, 4th, and 5th bikes were pretty much on the same second, like they almost exactly the same time. So I would just say it's middle of the pack, middle of the road, and that's kind of how it felt. The track we used had a good variety of stuff, but it wasn't the absolute steepest, where I think, in certain scenarios, this bike could be faster, but also it'd be slower. So I think middle of the road for me is a good representation of kind of where I'd put its speed.
Alicia, would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, mine was 3rd out of 7, so pretty similarly middle of the road. It was, so my middle bikes, I had one outlier that was significantly faster than the rest. I had another outlier that was significantly slower than the rest. And all those middle ones are clustered within a few seconds of each other. So, I mean, they're all pretty close, but the Commencal was just a little bit slower than the Intense and just a little faster than the Patrol, like 1/10 of a second faster than the Patrol. And I attribute that just to how stable it felt pointed down the rough and steep stuff.
Let's move on to models and pricing. Kaz, tell me what the people can get.
Yes, like I mentioned before, this one's kind of the a la carte version of the SX Team at $5,800. But if you're on more of a budget, there is the $4,000 SX Essential. And that one's got a really good parts kit too. SLX brakes and drivetrain mixed with some Fox performance parts. So
that's going to be a winner.
Yeah, it's a good solid build kit, good price, good value. So the Essential is definitely worth a look.
On to pros and cons. Alicia, let's start with the good stuff first. I think you're going to tell me that you like how stable this bike is.
Yeah, I like how stable the bike is, especially at high speed once you kind of get it going. It surprised me with how well it holds on to kind of high lines. Like those sort of precarious lines where you just need to hang on, this bike will do it. And I appreciated that about it. It was fairly comfortable on fast, open terrain.
Especially, like, it's been so wet when you guys have been testing. Yeah. So wet.
Traction has not been easy to find a lot of the time. And so the bikes that held those lines really well were a little less sketchy.
All right, Alicia covered the good stuff. Kaz, Mr. Negative, what didn't you like?
There's not a lot of negatives, and we keep talking about it is a lot of bike. So for some people that are looking for that quick, nimble, agile thing, this isn't it. And even if you've ridden Commencals in the past and look at this and you're like, mullet bike, it's gonna be super lively, it's not that bike.
Who should consider this bike, Alicia?
I mean, if you ride bike park a lot, I think this would be an amazing bike park bike. If you do some enduros and want to prioritize performance over the rough stuff, over pedaling ability or nimbility, as some say, this also could be a good bike. Pretty solid all-arounder, unless you're prioritizing twisty-turny trails and rolling terrain.
That is it for the Commencal Meta SX. I hope you guys like this review. It sounds like a bruiser of a bike. Let us know what you think about it in the comments under this review, and stay tuned because there's a whole bunch more coming.